Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the ITSM Integration in Cloud and Container Resource Optimization webinar. My name is Daniela and I'll be the moderator for today's session. We have with us today Andrew Hillier, co-founder and CTO at Densify, and Amit Jowhary, VP of Product Management and Technical Services at Densify.
Thanks, Daniela, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to kick this off with a little bit of background on what we do and kind of queue up the problem that we're talking about today. And I'm going to hand it to Amit, who's going to cover the majority of it, which is what we really want to hear about ITSM integration, change management, and how that applies to resource optimization. And we've got quite a bit of experience. Amit and team do a lot of work in this area, and really interested to hear him talk about this. Before we go there, just some slides on what we do. So we do resource optimization. The problem we solve really is that in cloud and containers, usually the resources are incorrect. It's the simplest way to put it. They're either things are too big or they're too small or they're both. It creates waste and extra cost. It creates operational risk. And it's really hard to fix because of the way organizations are set up and the divisions of responsibilities. And that's a big topic of what we'll talk about today and how to kind of overcome that using ITSM integration to kind of bridge the gap. One of the biggest business problems we see out there is cost. I mean, you can't really avoid it. You can get very expensive cloud builds if you're not careful. And we like to view this as kind of an iceberg where there's really two components of the cost. One is almost the how you buy, the procurement, the discount, working on getting a better price for what you're paying. And then in our view, a bigger portion is kind of the what you're buying, the resources, the infrastructure, and optimizing the resources. And so that's the amount you're paying for, really price times quantity is what cost is. So what we found is that the industry has done a good job of focusing on price. It's usually the first thing that you get hit by. There's lots of products that go out there and will tell you what your bill is saying. There's been less focus on what you're paying for. And no matter what discount you have, if you're running twice as much infrastructure as you need to be, or 4 times as much, or 10 times as much, it's going to be expensive. Even if you get a discount, you're still overpaying. So that's really what we focus on, is the bottom part of this pyramid, and kind of fit it into the roles we see in our customers. And there's of course nowadays there's a FinOps role, really focusing on the financial operations. And there's some functions that we consider to be kind of almost purely FinOps, like the budgeting and the understanding your bill and cross-charging, that kind of stuff. And that's all extremely useful. We don't get into that. There's lots of great solutions out there, third party or from the providers that do that kind of stuff. We tend to focus below this line on the actual resources. And in that world, there's a couple of factors. One is the actual deployment of the apps. So there's usually teams building, deploying the apps. That's where the resources get specified these days, in your DevOps pipeline, in your Terraform files, in your CloudFormation. But we still find there's a big gap in the resource optimization where there's not a lot of attention paid to what those resources are set to. You're deploying a small or a medium or a large, 1 or 2 at a time. And it doesn't seem that bad if you don't get it exactly right. But if you have 10,000 of them, it's a big problem. And so we see organizations with a lot of infrastructure on the floor, so to speak, in the cloud, that's not right. And even if it was right when it was deployed, it's not right, months later, weeks later, months later, it's wrong. But there's not a good discipline to go back and focus on it. And things like, is it the right size? Are the instances the right size? Or are they the right type of instance? Should I be using burstable or CPU optimized or that type of thing? Scale groups, elasticity, containers, all these things we find are areas that need a lot of focus to make sure that you're running a tight ship. Again, even if you have the best discounts from the provider possible, you can usually get huge improvements by then focusing on the resources and or reduce risk, because a lot of times things are also too small and that creates operational risk. That's where we fit in. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what we do today or how we work, but I do want to talk about where it fits in and then hand off to Amit. So if you look at this same kind of concept, but in practice, usually we have app teams, app owners, cloud engineers, various titles over there, but basically they're the ones that are deploying the logic, and their focus is on getting that new release out and making sure that there's proper functionality in whatever your app happens to be. It gets deployed on the infrastructure or in containers in the cloud infrastructure. Again, somebody gets a bill and it's huge. And the real challenge here is that there's a big disconnect here. The people getting the bill don't really have direct control over the resources, in those Terraform files, what's going out there. So they're kind of disconnected, and all they can really do is kind of persuade, throw reports across that bridge, make top 10 lists, and some of that can be effective, but they really can't directly impact what resources are being deployed. And so what they tend to focus on is buying discounts and structuring the enterprise deals so that you pay the minimum possible outside affecting the resources. Where we come in as Densify is we say, well, we can actually do a better job of this and close this loop, because we have very deep analytics that will to learn the patterns of all the workloads and understand what they're running on and what the types they're already on are, and kind of do a bunch of number crunching and come up with very precise recommendations. And I'm not going to go into this today as far as how we work. We have other webcasts that talk about the analytics in great detail. The idea is to come up with an exact recommendation that you can actually take, not something that's an estimate or might work or might not. It has to work. So one of the key themes here is that you have to have a good recommendation. That's the start of everything, and that's a big focus of ours. And then when you have that recommendation, you can make things better. But even with the perfect recommendation, you can't do what's on this slide. In a VMware environment, you used to be able to do it. You can go change your running VM or move a VM and it'd be fine. But in the cloud, you can't directly affect the infrastructure for a couple of reasons. There's many reasons, but the two big ones are whatever you change it to, it's going to go right back to what's coming from the pipeline. Like again, if a Terraform file is driving that workload, whatever you do has to go into that Terraform file. You can't just change things in the field. And the bigger one, which is the topic of today, is nothing happens unless these people want it to happen. And that's absolutely as it should be. They're responsible for the app working. And so they're not going to put some, half-baked recommendation into play. They need to understand it. They need to approve it. So there's a whole step here where to do this properly, you really need to have a whole bunch more on this diagram. You need to have ITSM and change management involved and all these pieces working together to make sure that when you have the recommendation, even if it's a perfect recommendation, for it to happen, it has to go to these folks on the left, they have to approve it, and it has to happen in a very safe way. And so we've done a lot of work on this. Amit and his team spearheaded this. They work with our customers and they've developed the ITSM integration, and he's going to go through that, and then I'll circle back at the end and close it off. Right now, I'm going to hand it over to Amit to talk in more detail about this ITSM integration.
Thanks, Andrew. In the past several years, we've worked on integrating many ITSM systems, change management systems, primarily ServiceNow and Jira. But the way we built this module is it can connect to any change management system as long as there's an API. So there needs to be an API. So for SaaS implementations, it's pretty standard. Off late, we've been working on a Jira integration that's on-prem. It's pretty closed down. So we're working on getting ourselves whitelisted. So there are ways out of it, but ideally, if it's, API access is kind of the key thing. As long as we have that, this module kind of works nicely. One thing we have found out that every implementation that we've dealt with is quite different. There's some common aspects to it, but there's a lot that's custom. And all these config managements allow you to do that. And even within organizations, not across organizations, it's different. Like one team may use different fields and have different mandatory fields and what you can put in pick list values, etc., to another team. So there's quite a bit of a challenge. It's not just, just connect to something and magically everything will just work. So there's a bunch of things, and I'll just go through a little bit of those because that's key to how we can make this sticky and work through it. Another big aspect is you can't manually log into a UI, right click and create tickets. That's not scalable. On the other side, you can't just do this and create, 2,000 tickets on day one across the organizations and hope people will be happy and things will just happen. So it has to be controlled manner, it has to be scoped out. So those are some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So the scope, the volume frequency, the content, and suppression, what to do once the ticket is created. There's a lot of thought we've put in, and it's worked pretty well. Most of our customers are getting a lot of value from this because we have this in such a controlled manner. I'll kind of go through some of these with some real examples and talk through some of these. This is a sample dashboard of a Jira integration. Just to orient you quickly, on your left top, there's the pattern of how many tickets we are opening weekly. What is the status of those tickets we've opened? So that's the pie chart on your top right that shows you all these statuses. And then on the bottom, you have all the details of every ticket we opened and what was the actual recommendation, who was it assigned to, with some filtering on the site. So I'm going to use this in the background to just talk to these various 4 items through this dashboard. I think it'll just make it much more simpler to follow along. Firstly, you're just going to talk about scope. So as I was saying, you can't just create 2,000 of these on day one and just think it'll just magically, be okay. So we have to scope, right? So it's, there may be some teams that are getting pressure on price or performance, and those are the ones we want to target first. Those are will be more receptive to these tickets. So, identify, which teams are those, which app owners are those. And based on any business tag that you have, we can scope it down. So I'm just showing you a sample of, what our config looks like. And as you can see, it's more, SQL-like, which gives us a lot of flexibility. So, I don't want to touch Oracle because the vendor says it has to be this spec and no one should touch it. Or Henry and Anna are not ready. They're busy with something else, so don't disturb them. So it gives us a lot of flexibility on scoping down which teams app owners, line of businesses, type of applications we want to target. It's not only the app owner or the application, but it's any business tag you may have in cloud.
And Amit, just a quick question. I assume there's an effect here where starting off with a friendly group is recommended, right? Where you usually want to start with just one that's willing to work with you to make it all work and then move on to that.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, it's the friendly group and the one who's actually facing pressure. And it's actually easy to find those. In my experience, it's been like, oh yeah, this group is willing and friendly because they're getting pressure from their leadership to reduce costs or improve performance. So that's, finding that is very key. Once we find that, then it kind of snowballs into other teams seeing their success and kind of coming on board. The next is the type. So as I was saying, if there's cost pressures, you probably want to focus only on the ones that will save. So that's your downsizes, your modernizes, your terminates. It may not necessarily be dealing with the upsizes because that improves performance, but it also increases costs. So again, there's controls in just making sure that you're just going against the right type. In one customer that I work for, they want to reduce costs, but terminates was a step too far, right? It's like, oh, no, I'm not going to shut down anything. That's not our mandate. So, just on that little sample I have, that you just have the top two, downsize and modernize, and we remove terminates there. So a lot of control there in how we kind of configure this once we've identified which team we're going against. The next is the cost. Again, it's important. You don't want to do all this work to save $2 a month. So, it's like, you can start with save me the maximum, and looking at all recommendations, you may see, yeah, 200 a month or higher, or maybe 500 a month higher is the minimum. And again, tweak these as you go along. It's not set in stone. 6 months later, you can say, okay, I've dealt with all the 500 pluses. Now let me go with the 200 pluses, right? So you can start tweaking these. And the whole idea is let's get some small set, actionable, with a friendly team, right recommendations, and that's gives us the biggest chance of success. Another one is the effort. I'm going to touch on this when I show you a detailed report in a bit. There is effort related to all these changes. Some of them are very simple. It's a modernize, going from a C5 to a C6, no problem. Some of them are family changes. You may have to think about disk. You may have to think about drivers. So the effort may be a little higher. So again, you can control, maybe you want low-hanging fruit first, and as tickets start drying out, you can turn the knob and get some of the more high effort ones or medium effort ones, but now you're ready to deal with those. So again, just gives you a lot of control over where you want to start with, and then start moving the knob to getting more recommendations down the road.
Just a quick note on that, I mean, just so everybody understands that. It's not that the effort isn't something that you estimate. The analytics generates an effort based on a rule engine to say, as Amit alluded to, you might be losing a local disk. So you'll save a ton of money, but you should look at it. And so that lets you filter based on what's coming out of the analytics, which again is huge, because sometimes it is nice to go after the really easy stuff first.
Next is volume and frequency. So again, you don't want to drown people in tickets because everyone will start ignoring them, or it'll be too much of noise and frustration. So, volume could be I want once a week, maybe on a Monday morning, and I want to see only 10 tickets, right? And so that's kind of volume and frequency. Again, that's fully controllable. We've also had cases where you want to turn it off, maybe during Christmas time. It's like, oh, no one's working right now. We don't want to come back after a Christmas break and see, 200 tickets there. So again, a lot of control over how many, how often, with controls to kind of turn it off when needed. The next is the ticket content. So this is, again, a big one that we work very closely with our customers and the teams. As I was saying earlier, even within teams, you could have different formats, and what are the fields, which ones are mandatory, which ones require a pick list, which one may have some custom logic. So there's a bunch of mapping that is required from the actual ticket in your change management system to Densify recommendations and properties that we have. And many times it's not even a one-to-one mapping. In one case, there was a country code, but neither Densify nor AWS had the country code. So we had to put some logic to say, okay, look at the region, and based on the region, if US starts with US, then it's North America, and then so on. So it just depends on how it's configured. Every customer we work with, it's something different. So there's a bunch of work that's required here to just make sure that the content of the ticket is good. Otherwise, you won't be able to create it, or it'll be half-baked, and folks are going to just reject it. That is, again, very important to get all those mappings correct, so all the fields are properly populated. Another big thing is the people who are looking at this may or may not have deep Densify knowledge. So if you just tell someone, hey, you can move from a C5 to an M5, why are they going to believe you? It's like, okay, there's a ticket here. It's some tool that's creating it. Why should I believe it? Why should I spend all this time? So the very key thing is all our tickets we attach the app owner report. So the app owner report is nothing but a detailed report of why we are giving that recommendation. It's sort of your show your work, right? What's happening with that recommendation? So someone who's not fully trained and knowledgeable about Densify can still look at it and say, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. You have given me enough proof. That's again a very key component. Without that, it's hard to make it stick. So just a very quick note on the app owner report, and just to show you the power of it. And when something like this is attached to a ticket, there's just so much more chances it's going to flow nice through your process. Tells you all about the instance, some metadata about the instance. So it's just not a name. You have more context of what the instance is, where it's running, who owns it, what application it's running, what is the recommendation type. So you see the red box on the top, it says go from a C4X large to a C5 large. What are the policies applied? So again, Densify is a deep policy engine. So this kind of tries to give you a summary of what are the policies that are applied, how many days you're looking, what are your thresholds. Next is some really nice charts before and after. So you can say, okay, yeah, I can see why you're telling me to go from an X large to a large. I can see CPU and memory are way below my threshold. So even after I go to a large, so I'm taking away some CPUs and memory, it's still manageable. It's still way below my threshold. I have a lot of headroom. So it gives me confidence in, okay, looking at the last 60 days, this should be a safe recommendations to take. And then lastly, another important point of this report, but basically this is a big PDF that's attached to it that also can be sent around if needed. A big thing is about the effort that Andrew and I were mentioning a few minutes ago. Is this is Densify coming up with this through its rule engine. It's like, okay, you're going to go from Gen 4 to Gen 5. There's a Nitro hypervisor. There's new generation of chips that is being applied. And here's your cost savings. Again, a lot of good information in this app owner report, and this really makes the value of the ticket skyrocket. It says shown in the top right there, show me your work, just don't give me an answer.
And just a quick note on that, one of the most valuable recommendations is what we call cross-family, because you're not just the wrong size, you're on the wrong type of thing. And we've talked about it a few times, but in the providers, it's kind of complicated to go between families because, like we said, you might lose disk or get different networking. This rule engine will pick up all of that. It'll say, you're losing your disk, but you're not doing more than X IOPS, so you should be fine. And that's all tunable. So this is really what enables you to go cross-family, which is where we see the lion's share of the optimization occur. You're on the wrong type of thing altogether, but that's very hard to do without a rule engine and without showing your work in this way, so people can understand, okay, I understand now that it's been looked at in detail.
The last kind of major topic is the suppression logic. So like we've gone through, we scoped it out, there's a good frequency, we have a properly formatted ticket with a good attachment that shows our work. Once we create the ticket, now what? There's a bunch of things we need to do. So first of all, again, these are learnings. The ticket status can be very different. One customer used 300, 301, 302, 302 that meant something, and some other customer had 10,046 meant something. So again, it can be all configured very differently. So we need some sort of mapping to make it into human readable, like you're seeing on the screen here. What's rejected, what's open, what's in progress, what's completed. So there's that mapping that's required once we start reading the codes back. The other question is, what do you do with those? Once I've opened a ticket and it's been actioned, you want to relearn. Again, when you're on this new family type, let's say, for example, it's on a new set of hardware, more memory, less CPU, and so on. You need to kind of soak in that workload for a bit before we can say, okay, now we are ready to say, oh, maybe you need to go one size further down. So there's that sleep period. You don't want to have a recommendation 2 days after you just made one. So there's all these config settings of what to do based on the status code. So that example is completed. What if it's rejected? Because it could be rejected because the recommendation didn't make sense, which means that we may need to go back, tweak policies a little bit. So we ask the question, why was it rejected? Maybe it was rejected because we sent it to Henry, and Henry's just not, in the right phase to make recommendations right now. They have some other major projects going on. They'd like, come back after 6 months. So we have these sleep periods that you can see in that little XML snippet there that says, based on all these different codes that we receive back based on the ticket, we can have this suppression logic that makes it a little bit more realistic, right? So we don't inundate Henry with a million recommendations when he just clearly is not ready to take it. These just make it flow nicely. We have the right recommendations. We just reduce the noise that is produced.
I'll chime in for a second. As you mentioned, rejected, it's a great opportunity to do a feedback loop and make sure that the analytics are tuned properly. If they say, oh, that's part of a DR system and it's supposed to be idle, well, okay, well, you can model that in the analytics to make sure you give a different answer. So that can be a learning experience. And completed is very important to give credit. So in the table at the bottom, you can see the names of the people and how much money is associated with them. As things get completed, that can be attributed to those people, which we found is also extremely useful to make sure people get credit for doing the work to save the company money. Another key theme there is, and we've done podcasts on this topic, how to kind of incent people and reward them for doing what's right for the company and taking these actions.
Those are some of the key things I wanted to bring up that go into a successful ITSM integration. We open these tickets through this ITSM integration. It gets reviewed. That PDF is the app owner report that I was showing. Once it's approved, we read it back, we update it so we know it's approved. That can drive that pie chart. The flows that we see more typically are the tickets, the approved tickets have a separate flow, sometimes mostly outside Densify, where they already have a process and they go and change the CloudFormation, Terraform templates, and then that drives actual change.
This feedback loop is very important, I think, because it's the practical way to address that gap we talked about at the beginning. And even with a fairly manual, apply process, you start to see a pretty drastic impact, and the finance people become happy because the actual quantity of what's being bought goes down, not just the unit price being paid. The last thing I want to build on here is if we want to fully automate this, which is kind of what we see the holy grail for a lot of companies, if the status comes back, our analytics are aware of approval as well. This is native in our analytics. And so they understand that when something gets approved, a different answer can come out of our APIs as well. So if you're doing an API-based integration with things like Terraform, when that approval flow on the left occurs, the APIs will start giving you a different Terraform snippet to put in your code. So it's possible to do this in a completely automated way that is still change management aware and approved. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in. That's a little more sophisticated feedback loop, but we think people are going this way because there's so many cloud and container instances out there that you have to kind of start automating more and more. So, but automation that honors the change management process, we feel is where this needs to go. So that's just kind of the long-term eventual flow. But as Amit mentioned, a lot of people right now just use their existing processes to do it. Densify is also offered by Intel as Intel Cloud Optimizer. What we're describing here, the analytics side of it is available, and it can potentially be funded for a year if you qualify. So if you're interested in that, you can actually get the use of Densify and the cloud optimization analytics. It doesn't include all the integrations that Amit described. That's kind of on top if you want to tie it into your change management system, but the core analytics is available. There are other webcasts and resources. We've been doing a lot of webcasts around Kubernetes. All this applies to Kubernetes as well. Again, we have a ton of webcasts on Kubernetes, also how the engine works to come up with the answers if you're interested.
Thank you, Andrew and Amit. That was a lot of great content. We're just at the half-hour mark now. I do see some questions that have been logged.
Does your system write a Terraform? Simply recommend implementation. Our APIs will answer back native Terraform, and it gives you a TF-vars file. So if you and there's a Terraform module. So when you hit the API to get the TF-vars, put it in a folder where Terraform can see it, that'll happen automatically. So it's a pretty simple and elegant integration. We can certainly follow up with you if you have any questions on that. And I think the same person asked, so far we're talking about vertical sizing. What about horizontal? So horizontal comes in several ways. For example, if you're using replica sets in containers, we do track the replicas and how many there are and analyze them separately to come up with a single recommendation because they're all launching off the same manifest or launch configuration. So we do some pretty intelligent stuff for replica sets. We don't recommend how many replicas should be running. We feel that's better done by in more real time, closer to the app to understand what the scaling parameter is, but we will analyze the horizontal scaling and recommend vertical scaling that's intelligent based on that. The same is true of scale groups, where we will do a simulation of all the workloads using different instance types and come up with the one that seems to fit the workload the best and has the best scaling activity. So sometimes smaller, more granular nodes are better for doing fine-grained scaling. Sometimes bigger ones are better, and you get into warm-up time and all that type of stuff. So we do very intelligent scale group analysis as well.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Amit, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.